Tyson is this giant meatpacking corporation. They produce around 20% of the nation's chicken, beef, and pork. And recently, they announced that they would be undertaking a racial audit at the behest of investors who were worried that the company might be perpetuating systemic racism. So, according to Bloomberg, Tyson is at least the third major US company to say this year that it will conduct an audit after racial justice protests across the US in 2020. During the most recent proxy season, investors for the first time used shareholder resolutions to call for such racial audits, leading Wall Street firms BlackRock and Citigroup to agree. So part of the reason that Tyson investors insisted on a racial audit was that the hourly employees who had worked at the Tyson plants throughout COVID had been disproportionately Black and Latino, whereas Tyson's C-suites and boardrooms, as Bloomberg put it, remain overwhelmingly white. In fact, last year, the CDC found that 87% of coronavirus cases in meatpacking plants were among racial or ethnic minorities. But does that mean that the right solution here is a racial audit? Let's dive in. As you probably remember, meatpacking plants were deadly hotspots for COVID outbreaks in 2020, and Tyson was one of the very worst offenders. Here's some firsthand testimony from two Tyson workers at the height of the pandemic.
It's very fast-paced. It's very, very intense. Line speeds are designed to run 140 birds a minute. Everyone is standing, not even arm's length apart.
There's absolutely no way that we can social distance within these plants.
Meat processing plants around the country have become COVID-19 hotspots.
More than 10,000 workers in poultry and meat plants have contracted the virus. At least 30 have died. We now have mask and temperature checks. Tyson even put up plastic barriers between workers. But these measures can only do so much for when we're cramped together on these lines. The reason our plants continue to be super spreaders is because Tyson forces us to process so much chicken so very quickly.
The rate that they have to get these orders processed, it is physically impossible to social distance.
If we slow down the lines, less workers will be needed. And by doing so, we can be able to social distance from each other and be more safe. We may be feeding America, but we're sacrificing our own selves.
An investigative report last year from ProPublica further confirmed these details. A team of investigative journalists at the outlet wrote, "Scores of emails and other records show that best practices to protect workers, such as slowing the processing line to accommodate social distancing, installing plexiglass barriers, and having workers wear masks, were not implemented until outbreaks began to occur. Instead, meatpacking companies spent crucial early weeks urging officials to keep their plants open." So in other words, Tyson and other meatpackers flat out denied their workers were at risk until the evidence was just too overwhelming to brush under the table. And even after more than 6,500 meatpacking workers nationwide had tested positive for COVID, Tyson ran full-page paid ads in national newspapers stating that the food supply chain was, quote, broken, and that meatpacking plants should therefore continue to operate. Then President Donald Trump soon after signed an executive order mandating that slaughterhouses stay open under the Defense Production Act. And if all that wasn't enough, don't forget that this also happened at Tyson.
7 managers at the Tyson food plant in Iowa that was the site of a massive COVID-19 outbreak have now been fired. This after an investigation confirmed they placed bets on how many workers would catch coronavirus. The outbreak at the food plant in Waterloo infected more than 1,000 employees and killed at least 6. Lawyers for families of 4 of the deceased claimed earlier this year that the plant manager had organized a betting pool for supervisors to wager on what percentage of plant workers would test positive for COVID-19. An investigation into the claims confirmed those allegations, leading to 7 top managers at the plant losing their jobs. An attorney for the families of the victims called the supervisors' actions, quote, ghoulish, adding that they literally gambled with workers' lives.
As we now know, Tyson's actions last year were disastrous for workers. A congressional report released just a few months ago found that coronavirus infections and deaths among meatpacking workers in the U.S. were nearly 3 times higher than previous estimates. At Tyson in particular, 29,462 employees contracted COVID and 151 people died. That's more than twice as many infections and deaths as any other meat producer. And lest you think that this was just a freak instance of mismanagement during an unprecedented public health crisis, keep in mind that Tyson plants were rife with labor abuses even prior to the pandemic. As Quartz noted earlier this year, the company has some of the most injury-prone jobs in the US. The injuries among poultry workers come from the strenuous cutting and hanging motions required to process chickens, which, particularly when done at high speeds, can lead to carpal tunnel syndrome. The fast speed demanded of the workers also increases the risk of cuts and gashes. In fact, in 2016, at least one analysis of OSHA data revealed that there were 34 amputations at 10 Tyson plants within the first 9 months of 2015 alone, which, if you do the math, comes out to an average of 1 amputation per month. The next year, an Oxfam report revealed that workers at Tyson and at other meatpacking plants were routinely denied bathroom breaks, forcing some workers to wear adult diapers on the slaughterhouse line. Given all of that, it's probably not much of a surprise that Tyson, in addition to being a demonstrably dangerous employer, also has a history of lobbying to undermine workers' comp in state after state. As reporter Michael Grable wrote, using its economic leverage, combined with time-honored whining and dining and behind-the-scenes arm twisting, Tyson has helped steer legislative changes through several states in the South and Midwest. It has urged officials, often successfully, to remove or appoint workers' comp judges. And the company's lawyers have crafted novel legal arguments for limiting the rights and benefits of injured workers. So thanks to these lobbying efforts by Tyson and by other big businesses, injured workers are finding it harder and harder to access benefits and care, and employers are now paying some of the lowest rates for workers' comp insurance that they have in decades. This all brings us to the question of why Tyson investors thought to address the company's horrific labor practices, made even worse by the pandemic, with a racial audit. First of all, racial equity is a completely inadequate and frankly misleading framework for making sense of Tyson's willful and profit-driven disregard for its workers before and during the pandemic. Does anyone in their right mind really think that if Tyson's corporate board had been staffed with a few more non-white millionaires, that this would have somehow mitigated the company's efforts to juice their profits by sacrificing workers' safety? Or does anyone really think that if Tyson's slaughterhouse workers had been 60% white, 13% black, 18% Hispanic, and 5% Asian, that what happened at those plants during the pandemic would have been acceptable? Make no mistake, during the pandemic, the capitalist class committed a massive crime against essential workers. Over the same year that 269 meatpacking workers lost their lives, the profit margins of the 4 largest meatpackers, which of course includes Tyson, jumped 300%, and Tyson owner John H. Tyson saw his personal net worth grow by $600 million. In addition to that, according to Reuters, these companies recently also announced $1 billion in new dividends and stock buybacks on top of the more than $3 billion they paid to shareholders since the pandemic began. So investors calling for and Tyson agreeing to a racial audit as penance for their practices during the pandemic may sound progressive on a very superficial level, but will almost certainly let the company off the hook for the greed that resulted in the deaths of more than 150 employees. Let's look at the companies that have undergone these so-called racial audits in the past. You might remember that after 2 Black customers were racially profiled at a Starbucks location in 2018, Starbucks agreed to undergo a racial audit. The result? Mandatory anti-racism training for all employees. Similarly, in 2016, Airbnb agreed to their own racial audit. The result? Adding new language about non-discrimination to their user agreements. In other words, these are the types of measures that are extremely easy for companies to implement and also pose no threat whatsoever to a company's bottom line. In fact, earlier this year, Tyson itself announced that it had hired its very first Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer and was also instituting unconscious bias training throughout the company. But the truth is that neither faux progressive technocratic fixes like racial audits or more diversity officers can even begin to curb the type of labor abuses that Tyson has been perpetuating for years. Tyson has been able to get away with their egregious treatment of workers not because of some vague racial equity gaffes, but because of capital's decades-long relentless assault on labor. As Michael Grable and Bernice Yu wrote in ProPublica last year, across the country, workers had been losing leverage against companies for decades. Workplace safety rules had been targeted by Reagan-era deregulation. Unionism was in a downward spiral. And in meatpacking, corporate power had grown with industry consolidation, forcing the once mighty packing house workers union to merge with less fiery labor groups that also represented other industries. Now, of course, we can't just snap our fingers and rebuild the labor movement overnight. But as we move forward from the pandemic and companies continue to exploit and abuse so-called essential workers, we have to be clear-eyed about what kinds of measures actually improve the lives of workers and which ones are just window dressing opportunities for investors who want to feel like they're good people by advocating corporate social responsibility. Right now, at least one thing is clear: Tyson's racial audit is worse than useless. So, Paul, I want to say this was not just a long-winded setup for you to talk about the Packing House Workers Union again.
Well, it's funny that came to mind. I'm going to get on that, but yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, well, I just wanted to say that I'll let you get into this, but the fact that the Packing House Workers Union has such a long and successful history of fighting for racial equality, to me, makes the Tyson racial audit like even more ridiculous.
Yeah, and it had me thinking about, so I've spoken on the show before about the United Packing House Workers of America. They no longer exist in that form. They've merged. And so, a lot of meatpacking workers are represented by United Food and Commercial Workers. But in its heyday, I mean, probably one of the best, proudest examples we have in the labor movement of an interracial union that took on racial justice. And, the main, that fight allowed for so many Black workers, like meatpacking became a source of like a blue collar middle class job for Black workers. And really, it was the decline of that industry and that union, and who suffers from that the most? Black workers. And really, the biggest explanation for that was them automating so many of their plants and deliberately moving out of areas that were union strongholds. And again, like, who are the first workers who are going to be fired in that scenario? Often Black workers. So it's just very ironic thinking about what are the real causes of like the decline of meatpacking and the weakening of the union that was so important for so many Black workers. And I don't think racial audits are gonna get at it. And
right.
Another egregious thing, I think this was just coming in recently. To its credit, the White House, I think, released a report around inflation, kind of highlighting how many companies are just price gouging. They're taking advantage of a certain situation. And I believe the meatpacking companies are among the groups of companies doing that, and that's where we're seeing prices, being inflated specifically. So that's another thing they're getting away with, but they can posture around this sort of stuff to make it seem like they're doing something.
Right. Yeah. I did see that White House report, and I think it is pretty clear that the meat companies are jacking up prices, and let's just say that that money is not going back to labor. But when it comes to stuff like the so-called racial audit, anybody who is a watcher of the show will know that I'm always going after the diversity, equity, and inclusion industry, and one reason is I think that it's so easy for a company like Tyson, or really any other company, to point to the fact that, like I said, 87% of the people who caught coronavirus in these meatpacking plants were non-white. It's so easy for these companies to point at that and be like, "Look, systemic racism," and sound like an activist, right? And in some senses, was it systemic racism? I'm sure you can make some sort of academic argument about why systemic racism had something to do with that. But at the same time, we actually have a clear and defined cause of what put these workers at risk. It was management.
Right. Yeah. And, it's also, I think systemic racism has reached the era where it becomes almost meaningless because it means different things. And it's like, if by systemic racism, you mean the fact that Black and brown people, for historical reasons, are disproportionately working class and disproportionately likely to be in these situations, then yes. But, I don't think a lot of people necessarily mean that when they say it.
Well, Tyson management definitely doesn't.
Yes, right.
But also, by invoking systemic racism, they kind of like get the double whammy of sounding progressive. But then also, if the problem is systemic racism and not just your horrific labor practices, then the solution is a racial audit, right?
Right. Yeah, and companies have been hip to this. I mean, we've had on this show Richard Hooker twice now, president of Teams of 623 in Philadelphia, representing UPS workers. And something he always says to me is the company has gotten really good at making their managers look like their workers and seem like part of the family, and like kind of beating the union almost on the cultural front. But so it's like, okay, UPS managers now, it doesn't matter if they have tattoos and whatever. And, it's so they can play that game really easily,
I want to turn it over to you in a second, but the last thing I want to hit is just this idea of shareholder capitalism, or like this idea that shareholders can prod companies or compel companies that they invest in to be better, I guess, because this was kind of the driving force behind this whole Tyson racial audit. What happened was a group of investors were like, hey, like, we don't like what we're seeing with regard to what happened during the pandemic. It looks really bad that the C-suite is all white, and basically everybody who got infected and died is Black or brown. We also know that there have been instances of discrimination, and this just isn't good for the company. So we, the shareholders, are calling on the company to do something about systemic racism, and what we're going to do is conduct a third-party racial audit. There's been a lot of talk, I think, during the kind of, racial reckoning of the last year about how corporations or how shareholders and corporations can like do better by their employees of color or fight systemic racism in some way. I hope it's clear that I'm skeptical. I mean, the shareholders at the end of the day still want to return on their investment. You're right. I'm so sorry, you guys. I'm like, in case you didn't know.
Right.
No, I mean, but this idea that the shareholders, or this idea that investors can do some good, they're still looking for a return on their investment, aren't they?
Yeah, and I'm sure the solutions are right in front of their face. I'd be willing to bet if you look at one of these meatpacking plants represented by the UFCW union, if they could videotape their last bargaining session, the latest contract, I will bet you all the money I have that the company was vociferously opposing every single health and safety measure the union was proposing, and whatever health and safety measures exist, I'm sure the union had to fight tooth and nail. And so those would be the obvious answers to what we saw during COVID and any worker health and safety issue. But of course, why do that?
Why do that when you can do a racial audit?
Yeah, love it.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.